Ladies and gentlemen, apologies for the late start. Is this on, Jonathan? Okay. Apologies for the late start. Welcome to another event with the Max Bell School of Public Policy. My name is Chris Reagan. I'm the director of the school. And actually tonight we have an event that is a partnership between the Max Bell School of Public Policy and the Douglas Coldwell Layton Foundation. Now, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are situated here on the traditional territory of the Kanigahaka, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous people. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. As I was thinking about the land acknowledgement, I decided to go into Google and find out what inflation was like in pre-settler times. And as it turns out, there is no data that StatsCan produces on that particular fact. So I apologize that I didn't have more information to present to you on that. I'd like to actually turn it over immediately to Carl Belanger, who is the past president of the Douglas Coldwell Layton Foundation. He is a native of Quebec City, a longtime social democrat activist, and a former national director of the New Democratic Party of Canada. Carl joined the ranks of the NDP at 18 years old and ran twice for a federal seat. He held several positions within the NDP and joined the parliamentary wing shortly after the 1997 federal election. During his political career, Carl served as a senior advisor to successive NDP leaders, Alexa McDonough, Jack Layton, Nicole Turmel, and Tom Mulcair. Where have you gone? There we are. Carl Belanger, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and merci beaucoup à l'école Maxwell de politique publique et à l'Université McGill d'accueillir cette conférence académique. Really happy to be here on behalf of the Douglas Coldwell Layton Foundation. I am the past president, was the president for about 6 years after I retired from active politics. At the time, the foundation was named Douglas Coldwell. And then over the past few years, we've worked on a modernization progress that culminated with the addition of Jack Layton in our foundation to honor his legacy and to modernize the entire foundation that was created in 1971 by Tommy Douglas himself. When he retired from politics, he wanted to create the equivalent of the Fabian Society in the UK. A place where you could discuss ideas and make sure that the progressive movement would have some kind of a think tank. But you know, over the years, as new trends emerged, the foundation had kind of become reduced to just give a few scholarships here and there, and not doing much of anything other than giving grants to other worthy projects, such as the Broadbent Institute, such as Rabble.ca, some of you may be familiar, and other progressive initiatives. But we decided to change that and to occupy more space. And this lecture and other lecture series that we are launching across the country is part of that modernization effort to make sure that the legacy of our founders, T.C. Douglas, M.J. Coldwell, and Jack Layton, and G.S. Woodsworth are you know, kept alive and being reflected upon as students and academics look at what shaped Canada, what shaped our country. Jack Layton would have been really happy to see this happening. Jack was very fond of McGill University. I mean, couldn't shut up about it. And for a guy from Quebec City who went to Laval, I can tell you, it got a little irritating from time to time. But he was really fond of McGill, and in many ways, for Jack Layton and the NDP, McGill was kind of the genesis of what became the Orange Wave in 2011. You know, maybe his participation in McGill Français and his involvement here in student politics, and the influence he got from thinkers like Charles Taylor, and his understanding of you know, the need for Quebec to be part of a Canadian ensemble which included Quebec when it came to time to make transformative change. And that's the project he embarked upon. And that culminated, of course, with the 2011 Orange Wave. Now that wave has receded, it may come back, but that's for another lecture, I suppose. So I spent many years working very closely with Jack Layton, as I was his press secretary from the very first day he became leader. The day after he was elected leader, I was pushed in and say, you're now you're transitioning into his press secretary. And I remained with him at his side until his passing, which was an event that really transcended partisan politics, as you may remember. The people of Canada reacted with much emotions to his passing, and it speaks to his legacy as a political leader, which put partisanship aside from time to time. Not always, because it's kind of the system we live in, but that's the legacy we're trying to protect. The guy who tried to get things done, no matter your political orientation. And one of the sentences that he used to repeat to me regularly was, you can get a lot of things done in politics if you're not looking to get credit. I was like, well, but Jack, if you don't get credit, you won't do much things in politics very long. So we had this debate regularly, but that was his approach, and that's why he was able to deliver results when the opportunity happened. May it be with the Paul Martin government or with the Stephen Harper government. If he had an opportunity to get things done, he would seize it. And so we were really happy when the Layton family approached us to include Jack Layton's legacy within the foundation. And so today, this event, as I said, is part of a series of lectures. We hope that you will enjoy it. The foundation is a nonpartisan organization. We are hoping to keep that flame alive so that people can study social democracy, because who needs another book about Trudeau, frankly? But there's not a lot of books about the leaders of the social democratic movement, may it be labor leaders or political leaders. And en passant, there is a children's book about Tommy Douglas that is for sale at the front. That's my fundraising pitch just now. It's a nice book about the life. It's a children's book. So it's basically a kind of a comic book telling the tales of Timmy Douglas and how he came to Canada and became the political leader that he became, and the father of Medicare, and so on and so forth. So thank you to the Maxwell School of Public Policy for welcoming us and for the partnership. I think this is the first of a long series of events. We're really pleased that you are welcoming us here in this beautiful facility. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and we'll be happy to chat with you after. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. Now, Carl said that this was one of a series of events this year across the country, but it's also what a macroeconomist would call a time series of events. This is the first event in this partnership that we hope will be an annual event. But the partnership actually began last year. So last year I was approached by the foundation that wanted to make a contribution to the Max Bell School. And my response was, this is wonderful, thank you very much, but let's do something fun with it. And so my response to that, my idea about doing something fun, was let's have an essay competition. So we created the Jack Layton Policy for a Better Canada essay competition last year, and we wanted to choose topics that were near and dear to Jack's heart. So last year the topic was about declining housing affordability, rising house prices, what to do about it. This year we decided that the topic would be something that was very much in the news, which was not just inflation and what to do about it, but in particular how to protect low and middle income people from the harm of inflation. So that's what the essay competition was. And I am delighted to announce last year the winners were not from the Max Bell School. They were from a different part of the university. It's a competition that's open to any registered McGill graduate student. This year, the winners, and there are two winners because they are co-authors, are from the Max Bell School MPP, Master of Public Policy Program. Jimmy Beltran and Abigail Jackson. Can you join me up here? I'm just going to give you a little piece of paper, and then I'm going to promise you another piece of paper in the future. So you're Jimmy, I think. Yes. Thank you. Come on up. Jimmy Beltran, so you can all see him, and Abigail. Thank you. Thank you very much. Congratulations. Great job. The prize is actually a $5,000 check, which I don't have with me. So they will somehow split the $5,000 check, possibly equally. We could write a paper about how they will share it. But thank you very much. Now, also, in the panel discussion that's about to start, I've asked Jimmy and Abigail to take the first crack at the question period. So they will be kicking off the question period with questions that are probably motivated by their or from their award-winning essay. Okay? Thank you very much, and we'll see you shortly.
Thank you.
So now I'd like to invite Armine Yalnizyan and Francis Donald to join me on the stage. And I will just say a few things about them. On the event description, there is their full bio. I will not read their full bio, but I will tell you that Armine Yalnizyan we've known each other for a long time, Armine. Okay, yeah, not that long. Really, we're just new friends. She's a leading voice on Canada's economic scene. She's an Atkinson Fellow on the future of workers. She was with the Centre for Policy Alternatives, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, for many years and worked a lot on Income Inequality Project there. She was also president of the Canadian Association for Business Economics. She's also a bunch of other things. But the one thing that she is always is very engaged in real-world policy issues. So delighted to have Armine with us here today. Francis is the managing director and global chief economist at Manulife Investment Management. She actually, not all people in the financial sector, most people in the financial sector appear to work in Toronto, but Francis works and lives in Montreal, actually very close to me out in the West Island. Before she was at Manulife, she was at Scotiabank, Deloitte, Rubini Global Economics, and the Bank of Canada. So she's been in a lot of interesting positions. For tonight's discussion, I think you will find, at the risk of oversimplifying, we talked about in our organizational call that Francis might be representing the capital view on the issue tonight, and Armine might be representing the labor view. So let's just see if you can detect that. But what we're going to do is we are going to talk about inflation. So, and you all should have one of these pieces of paper on your chair. I asked Francis and Armine to send in one killer chart. So this one is Armine's. So at some point, Armine is going to talk to the killer chart. And the flip side is Francis's killer chart. So at some point, Francis is going to talk about that. I didn't get a killer chart. I am just going to be the moderate one here today. Capital view, labor view, and I'm Mr. Moderation. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us here tonight. Delighted to have you here. I'm going to ask you each for your opening big picture message, okay? And then we'll get into a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the floor. But Francis, how about if we start with you? What is the big thing you want to say, you want to make sure that nobody forgets?
Okay, well, you said that I'm the capital view, which sounds very Hunger Games, and you are correct. So I like to say I work on the dark side of economics. You can take much of what you learn in economics and apply it to a whole swaths of the world. In my world, I work primarily on trading desks and with hedge funds and portfolio managers. We use economics and our understanding of policy to effectively get a sense of where markets are going to go, and make money for our clients. That's the goal of what I tend to do in my day-to-day life, which is also why I need to constantly be balanced by economists like Armine, who bring me back down to earth. But I got to tell you, Chris, I started working in 2008, and as a result of that, it's upsetting to hear that.
It's funny.
Okay, it's funny. It's 2008 is when I started, and therefore for the almost entire length of the beginning of my career up until 2020, I only knew a world where inflation was running at 2% or below. In fact, from 2009 until 2020, only about 8% of the time did Canadian core inflation run above 2%. And I remember we would spend time debating our inflation forecasts. Would we do 2.1, 2.3, 1.9? And that all seems so cute in retrospect. And we did a lot of work on why we were existing in this post-GFC, post-global financial crisis environment. We had globalization trends. We had, cheaper labor. We had the rise of China. All of these factors were pushing down on inflation in a way that felt permanent to me and was the only thing that I knew. In fact, it was the only thing that huge swaths of the trading floor had ever known. When inflation started to rise in 2020, it's uncomfortable to say it, but I was definitely in the transitory camp. Because to me, inflation rising was an anomaly. It was a bug, not a feature. In my view, at the time, we would see supply chains heal, and as soon as we exited COVID, we would recognize that this blip in our data was temporary in nature. But over the past 2 years, we've had to rethink so much of what we know to be true about economics and inflation. We've come to recognize that this concept of globalization, well, it seems to be reversing course. We're moving into a deglobalization type of environment. The idea that we would have these free-flowing supply chains that could provide us with cheap labor and goods, well, that's going in the other way. And don't you know, they could actually get clogged up and keep us from getting the things that we want. So now as we generate our forecasts, we're not debating 2.1 or 2.3. We're debating 3 or 5. Are we going to be in an environment where we see inflation at 3% not as a bug, but as a complete feature of the way that we're going to move forward? And our strong conviction is that, yes, while we may be going into a period where we see the data dip, and I'm in the view that we will see a recession this year. There's a little banking crisis happening. Not sure if you noticed that one. That's probably going to push down on our inflation data in the short term. But longer term, we're looking at a new paradigm. We have to relearn much of what those who started in 2008 think about the world. And that requires questioning a lot of our economics textbooks. It requires questioning a lot of our economic models that are based on this concept of 2%. And it also requires questioning policy. Should central banks truly be targeting 2%? Our entire field is having to reevaluate that in real time right now. But I suppose, Chris, if you're asking me what the message is, it's that I have a lot to learn about inflation and this new environment that we're heading into next.
Okay, thank you. We are going to come back and touch on a few of those issues. Maybe not all of them, but certainly a few of them. Okay, Armine, big picture from the labor view.
Well, big picture from my view is thank you for having me be part of this. Frances is, I think, a rock star, and though she works for the forces of evil, she is still very, very smart, and I love hearing how she interprets how money should be moving and making you money. And I love the way Chris moderates everything. I have never been able to figure out what his politics are, so he's a great moderator. But he's one of the smartest people at being able to thread the needle on a variety of issues. So I'm in great company. And my big picture takeaway for you is this isn't your daddy's inflationary period. It isn't even your grandpa's inflationary period. We haven't seen anything like this. And my killer chart for you is one of the reasons why it gets very personal. So if I was to say to you that, all you have to do is don't even look at what any of the inside says, just look at the top of this thing, and we are heading into a period of dependency on the working age cohort that we haven't seen since the baby boom was born. Why is that? It's because fertility rates dropped in the last few decades. And the baby boomers are the biggest cohort of people Canada has ever seen. And by the way, this has happened in a neighborhood anywhere near you that went through World War II. Because after World War II, everywhere that went fighting had a baby boom. So this is happening through the global north. This isn't something unique to Canada. We're not struggling with something that everybody else isn't struggling with. And this makes the story of inflation less a story of inflation than a story of affordability and how we value the workers that we do have. That makes the narrative of fighting inflation by avoiding a wage price spiral tone deaf. It actually sounds like it's anti-labor, right? Because they're not going after profits. They're not going after the people that are making money. In fact, the solution for taming inflation guarantees that more people will be unemployed. And who will be unemployed? The very people who are biting the biggest bullet on inflation. The people who are low wage, who don't have a lot of wage increases, who are spending most of their income on shelter, food, and transportation. So we have got a really anti-labor policy that comes straight out of the 1990s, but we're not dealing with inflation that had the hallmarks of the 1990s. You know, Francis gave a really good description of why we had so many tailwinds to central bank policy that was in lockstep around the world in the 1990s to wrestle inflation to the ground. And we did. We wrestled inflation to the ground and saw unemployment spike to levels we had not seen in Canada since the 1930s. It was a policy-engineered level of unemployment that was, in retrospect, unnecessary because China had come onto the stage to give us low-wage goods from supply chains that we had never seen the likes of before. Unbelievable efficiency in bringing down prices, a little bit crappy when it comes to having a good job, but boy, would you get stuff cheap. And that's why we had inflation at such unbelievably low rates for so long. But today, not only are the issues that Francis mentioned coming back to bite us, population aging and small labor markets everywhere, labor shortages everywhere, the idea of potentially reshoring or friendshoring supply lines, which will mean that prices will go up on almost everything we do consume in terms of goods. War, political unrest everywhere, people actually fleeing climate change, which is also upsetting the way crop yields are emerging and the way herds are getting sick and diseased. So we have got this perfect storm of headwinds to drive prices up. And if our only solution is slowing the economy so supply can catch up to it, that's the mantra, and that means more unemployment of the people that are suffering the most, we have missed the boat. We have completely missed the big picture. And that's what I want you to think about. We are in a new era. We've gone through 40 years of labor surplus. We are in a new era of labor shortages that are everywhere, and we cannot afford to devalue our neighbors who don't make very much money.
Okay, so there's the big picture from both. So I'm going to back up, and my first question, it may actually kind of sound like we've already gone beyond it, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think you're both going to answer it differently. So the question is, why should we care about inflation? Why should we care about inflation? So Armine, you're first.
Okay.
And I think you're probably going to connect it to income distribution. And then Francis is probably going to talk about financial markets and foreign exchange and stuff like that. But you may also veer into each other's lane. That's fine. So you're up.
We care about inflation because of this picture. We have more people on low incomes and fixed incomes than at any point in history. They have no wiggle room. They will not tolerate more inflation. We also have more people that are earning very low wages. Did you know Canada's in the beauty contest in the world amongst the OECD to have the largest share of the labor market that is low wage? We've been kind of going back and forth with the United States for most of the last 20 years, but right now we have the largest share of the labor market that is low wage. That is not a contest you want to win. When you have a large share of workers that have low wages, and you have a large share of the population that is on fixed and low incomes because they're elderly, you have people that cannot tolerate inflation. So politically, we cannot afford to see prices go up at 3%, 4%, 5% every year when people don't get 4% or 5% every year. So that's one issue, and it's related to inequality, but it's not right on. The second reason we're worried about inflation, if we don't tame it, is that a large share of our workforce who pay the taxes to support the people who are not in the workforce, people who are too old, too young, and too sick, it's the working age population that pays most of the taxes in this country, that support the programs that we all use from cradle to grave. When they're not making a lot of money, and when more and more and more of their money is going to shelter and food and fuel, the basics just to get to work, then you've got a built-in drag that's over and above the drag of having more and more seniors in your economy. We've had, since the Second World War, the mantra of governments everywhere is GDP growth, right? That's your number one policy priority. But if inflation eats into the purchasing power of the people that pay the bills, you are going to have a double and unintended drag on economic growth, which is something that there is no politician out there that says that's cool. Well, there might be some Greens that would say degrowth is the answer, but degrowth isn't the answer. We can talk about that another time.
Okay, we'll invite you back for that. Okay, so low-income people, whether they are young or whether they are, and working, or whether they are retired, low-income people are the main hit here.
Seniors too.
And of course, we couldn't have had this conversation in the past 20 years because inflation has been low and stable enough and low enough that it's been ignored, basically, for the last 25 years in this country. Inflation has been about 2%. So from yours, the clear argument for either reducing inflation if we can, or dealing with inflation, or addressing it. So, Frances, to you, I have a feeling that your argument might connect more to the middle of the income distribution. I'm just guessing.
Well, I could make that argument, but I'll choose not to. I'll get to it. The problem that I have is we talk about inflation. So you say we should worry about inflation, but I don't even know what that means anymore. Okay, because we look at inflation prints that come out and we say, oh, inflation is 5% and change. That is not what is ruining Canada right now, or everybody else dealing with it. It's that the nature of inflation has changed. Early in the pandemic, I'm sure many of you remember, we actually had a significant amount of inflation in a narrow set of things. Do you remember what they were? Fitness equipment. I bought a rowing machine, I used it twice, I just sold it for 50% off on Facebook Marketplace. That's deflationary, by the way. Computer monitors, used cars. If you wanted to build a pool, it was through the roof. If you wanted to get a kitchen renoed, very, very expensive. In the first year and a half that we experienced this inflation that surged, it was all in goods and things that we did not need. They were optional luxury things. If you could afford them, good for you. What's happened in the past year is that the drivers of inflation, and even lately as headline inflation is starting to come down, have shifted towards the necessities. They moved heavily into energy, and they moved very aggressively into food, which worries me much more, because these are not optional. And to Armine's point, they are especially not optional for the lower income distributions of Canadians who have to spend a larger share of their income on it. So we talk about this headline inflation number, but that's not really the underlying problem. And I don't really care what headline inflation is, because that's not what's going to create damage. Now, there's another element of this story, and it brings into play central banks. Now, many global central banks have dual mandates or even triple mandates, which is they're responsible for price stability and some form of full employment, and in some cases, financial stability. They're the lenders of last resorts. It's their job to make sure we don't see bank runs that destabilize the entire country. What happened to central banks, and particularly the Bank of Canada, is they became excessively focused on inflation. Why? Because that's their only job. You know the meme? You had one job. And central banks have given the impression that they have failed at this. There is an entire institution that is trained and dedicated to bringing down inflation. And therefore, in every one of their communications, they talk about inflation, they provide forecasts for inflation, and they tell us that the path for interest rates ahead is wholly dependent on what inflation will do. Now, from a capital market / dark side perspective, this is putting an enormous amount of focus in financial markets, and it's also becoming incredibly important to the future of Canada via this indirect channel. Because I'm not sure if you've noticed, but the Bank of Canada has hiked rates by the fastest in history. We have never seen the Bank of Canada hike rates as quickly as they have right now. This is creating an additional surge, an additional cost of living increase for Canadians. My chart actually makes the point that the Bank of Canada is contributing to inflation because they are raising the cost of mortgages. So mortgage interest rate costs for Canadians as of this morning are up 24% year over year, much more for other people with a variable rate mortgage. That's contributing 10% to total inflation. So we have central bankers that are raising rates to combat other forms of inflation, but increasing unaffordability in other areas. Others will make the point that this is also increasing rents, because in limiting your access to the housing market, you maintain demand in the rental area. So all of a sudden you can see how inflation feeding through into the decision-making function of central bankers is fully contributing to the state of the economy in Canada. And I'm going to agree with Armine here. Is this the right decision? Are we artificially targeting a number like 2% inflation? I'm going to argue, as I have a lot in the last 6 months, very public. No, I had a baby, but before that, before I took that little tiny break. My baby's name is Jack, by the way, which I think is very good for today. Jack Lee. Anyways, oh, thank you. I have another one too, but I forgot about him already. So the problem that we have here is that we have a central bank that is wholly focused on one data point, headline inflation and core inflation, making decisions to target that have huge impacts on everybody across this entire country. So why do we care about inflation? Yes, it impacts us on the day-to-day, but it's also driving policy. And it might be driving policy in inappropriate ways that we as Canadians should be questioning.
All right. So we have moved into question 2, which is inflation measuring what we think? So let's go back to that a bit, because you talked about how there's a headline inflation rate of, well, it used to be 2%, now it's 5.5 or 6. But that doesn't mean that food prices are going up at 6. They might be going up at 15, or fuel prices might be going up different. And this is a complaint that economists and macroeconomists encounter all the time. People think we're crazy when we talk about inflation at 2% because some prices that they are following and noticing are going up way faster, or some of them are actually falling. So I'm going to turn to Armine here. What is the comment you want to make about whether we are looking at the right number? How do we think about inflation? So should we be upset at 5.5? Should we be thinking about a different number? I don't think you're going to talk about core inflation. That would be just too geeky.
Yeah, and not even for this crowd that showed up for a conversation about inflation would I do that. That would be cruel and unusual
You're calling
punishment.
them already kind of geeky, aren't you?
No,
it's okay.
I am actually.
It's okay, but I said it.
Anyway, I don't know what the number is, but sadly, I know you want more tension, but I agree with her.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay.
About the problem of using one headline number to say the problem is over, right? And that we are going to do whatever it takes to get that headline number down to 2, even if that involves cruel and unusual punishment for the people who are already hurting the most. I really want us to think about the problem being affordability, not inflation. And let's just do a little exercise in numbers. What if the Bank of Canada magically ended inflation? We had 0 inflation tomorrow. To Francis's point, prices are already 35% higher than they were this time last year on gas. A bag of pasta, according to Statistics Canada, is 29% higher than it was this time last year, on average, across the country. It depends on what it is you're looking for, but prices are higher in almost every category. So even if you had 0 inflation from here on in, which isn't what they don't want 0 inflation, that's too slow. So they want 2%, but let's say they could control that magic number. affordability still remains the problem, and particularly because of my magic chart here, which is upside down, but it doesn't matter. Just like you know that this problem here of a dependency ratio, the highest number of people depending on the working age that we have seen since the 1960s, but with half the background rate of growth, and not just lasting for, 8 or 9 years, going on for decades, according to Statistics Canada. So what's the solution to that? More immigrants. And what do more immigrants do? Because they're not babies living with the grown-ups. They're flat out adults that need a place to live. So if you don't add infrastructure to be able to deal with the problem of not enough workers, you're just inflating more housing prices. So it isn't just the Bank of Canada that's doing this. It's the fact that our solution to everything is bring more people in. That is Canada's go-to solution for any kind of shortages, like bring them in.
Okay, so I want to bring you back to affordability. So you're basically saying whether inflation is high or low, prices are already very high, and there's a whole chunk of the population that has affordability problems. So I want to push you on talking about how to address affordability. So this is not a central bank question, this is a government question, right? But then I'm going to ask Frances about how we do that in a way that does not stoke the inflationary fire. So you, I think, are going to give us a case for expanded public services.
You are right. I am going to do that.
See, I've jumped to question 3 because
you have. I can see that. Look at that.
You took me to question 3, so I'm going to question 3.
I'm going to take you down the garden path, Mr.
Okay.
Reagan.
So expanded public services to deal with affordability, and then Frances is going to tell us how to do that in a way that does not make inflation worse, because we all agree that inflation is not good.
I'm going to actually hearken back to Christine Lagarde, who in 2010 said, not that we needed...
head of the European Central Bank currently.
Now, and at the time...
Head of the IMF, right?
Thank
She's
you.
the GOAT.
She is the GOAT. Well, some people like her, some people
It's
hate
greatest of all time. It's like a younger person comment.
He didn't get it, did he?
Didn't know.
Wow.
Did you not watch football, man?
I don't, but we're moving on.
Okay. Anyway, Christine Lagarde, 2010, says basically...
You know that she used to be a synchronized swimmer,
Did you read How to Lead?
but you didn't know that.
I did, because I read How
Let
to
me know
Lead.
when you're
it's
done.
a wonderful book, and she's got a great profile in it.
Okay.
Okay, can I tell you why I was mentioning Christine Lagarde now?
You betcha.
Yes.
Thank you.
You betcha.
You too? Okay. Back then, in 2010, 2 years after the global financial crisis, actually not even 2 full years after the global financial crisis, she started whispering out loud so that everybody could hear that maybe it was time for fiscal policy to step up to the plate. She wasn't talking about a handoff from central banks to fiscal. She was just saying we need more balance between who's doing the heavy lifting here. Because for decades, we had relied on central banks to do the heavy lifting in economic engineering. And it was all fine-tuning of the 2% thing, right? But basically, governments have, left the building, by and large, especially in North America, where we had had this fetish about more market, less government for decades. Okay, so I'm not talking about government for the sake of talking about government. I'm talking about government because at the federal and at the senior levels of government, governments in Canada have mostly abdicated their responsibilities to the market, right? And when I think about whose namesake we are here for, Tommy Douglas introduced Medicare. Why? Because why spend $1 when 99 cents will do? That's a Tommy Douglas quote, right? Jack Layton was a champion of affordable housing and lived in social housing, but rent geared to income social housing. Why? Because he believed that not something as basic as shelter shouldn't be just a product of a market, that we needed to decommodify certain basic services like care, like housing. You do that and you kind of defang the market. Because you're actually adding supply outside of a transactional modality. You're saying no matter how much money you've got, we're going to make sure you have access to these things. That's why Frances lives in Montreal, by the way, because there's childcare here and has been since 1995, right? And you can see the effect economically on this province's participation rates of women, right? You pay more in taxes, but you get more in services. That builds solidarity, it builds resilience, it builds capacity, and it reduces your reliance on the market if you do it right. Quebec didn't do it right, but that's another conversation. You're going to have to invite us back.
Okay.
We've also done a lot of childcare panels together now that I think about it.
Yeah, well,
We've done those too.
because they're core now in an era of relying on people, the smallest working age cohort in history, and before the pandemic, 50% of payroll were women. Like, how do you expect women to give their all if you don't provide for some kind of care while they're doing paid work?
So are you going to argue that the federal government should be doing more on childcare, more on maybe more transfers to provinces so that they can do more on healthcare, more on dental care, more on education, more on, I don't know what other you want to add to the essential services list. But are you saying that the way we should deal with affordability, because we're not dealing with inflation now, we're dealing with affordability, is expanded government services? And then my question is going to be, and what's that going to do to inflation? Maybe it's not going to do anything, but you can think about that.
So the first point is that the federal government is financing affordable housing at roughly half the pace it was in the 1970s, when our population was growing at roughly a third of the pace that is growing right now. So we need the federal government, which actually borrows at the lowest cost in the entire system. The federal government borrows at a cheaper price than a province. A province borrows at a cheaper price than a municipality. A municipality borrows, well, can't borrow in most places. A big company borrows at a cheaper price than a small company. The federal government borrows at the lowest price in the system and should be borrowing money if money needs to be borrowed to build, baby, build. I'm going to channel Sarah Palin here. It's like, I don't want them to drill. I want them to build, and I want them to build like mad right now. If they're very serious that the solution to all our problems are more immigrants, and by the way, more migrant workers as well. And sorry,
okay.
and then the list also does include pharmacare, because I'm going to channel Tommy Douglas again. Why spend $1 when 99 cents will do? Why aren't we doing price volume deals? Mike Harris talked about it in the mid-1990s and wrested in amazing deals from pharmaceutical companies by just simply saying, we buy huge amounts of drugs and we are going to bargain a better price. You can also get better patent legislation to get patent drugs over to generics more quickly if the federal government is involved with a clinical effectiveness set of rules. There's so many things you can do that actually take the sting of the market out and manage our public resources, which are going to get harder and harder to come up with more effectively.
So if you want government to provide a lot of these things and you want them to borrow to do it, you didn't say you wanted them to tax to do it. You could have said that you want them to tax the rich people, but you didn't say tax at all.
Not yet.
So you just want to borrow. So, but if you're not going to finance that spending with taxation, and you're going to finance it only with borrowing, then that may actually contribute to inflation. No? So is this going to make the inflation problem or the affordability problem even worse?
Okay, so in a textbook with your lines, you've all seen these charts? Yes. But let's bring it into the real world a little bit more. So I think we should take a step back. We in Canada and in the policy environment, both central banking and all levels of government, like to believe that we are in control of our economy and our destinations. But increasingly, when I am asked to speak to policymakers, I try to make the point that actually we have less control over the development of our economy and what's happening here than we like to believe, particularly with inflation. A good deal of the inflation that particularly remains now in the system, in my opinion and based on our work, is coming from global factors. For example, eggs now cost more than a pound of meat, right? Do you know why? There's an avian flu that has decimated global chicken crops. We can hike interest rates all we want. It is not going to revive the chickens, okay? Semiconductors, massive shortage. Did anyone try to purchase a car in the last few years? It's a nightmare, okay? We got a car, and because we moved to Montreal, so we needed one, and the little panels where you press the buttons to get the windows out, it just falls out. Brand new car. We didn't have the semiconductors, they tell me. Well, we ran the numbers. Do you know that they could ban car purchases for an entire year out of Canada, and it would not change the price of semiconductors coming from Southeast Asia? It would have zero impact because our demand is so little compared to these global factors. We have deglobalization forces which are raising the prices for everybody across the entire world. And I'm sorry, but Governor Macklem can hike interest rates all he wants. It's not going to solve the conflict in the Ukraine and actually bring down food prices there. So when you start from that point and you realize that much of the inflation is happening to Canada, and there may be some segment that was exacerbated by CERB checks, then you have to start thinking about how the idea that we can't solve the inflation problem, we have to mitigate the inflation problem. This is my standpoint and where I come from. Now, the standard kind of perspective, especially from the 1990s, when a lot of the inflation was demand-driven, was that spending by the government would increase demand and then therefore contribute. But in the current environment, I believe there are several programs that we could be spending dollars on that would mitigate these challenges and also contribute to growth. If we want to borrow for them, a bond market, and I work with fixed income traders every day, is going to be looking at $1 of spending and not looking at the headline, just like they're not looking at headline CPI. They're going to say, what does that dollar contribute to the economy or prevent a recession from occurring? Because then Canada becomes someone that's a good idea to lend money to. So we have to be thinking about every dollar as different. Where is it being targeted? One of my favorite programs I think we need to move on ASAP is school lunch programs. Children eating lunch because food prices are through the roof and families are having trouble feeding their children is not inflationary. And I guarantee you that if there's a food budget or if there's a food program next Tuesday, I'm going to have to go on TV and hear someone tell me that the spending is inflationary. It's just factually untrue, and we're going to have to categorically reject that. Checks to all of us that we spend on more rowing machines we don't use, absolutely inflationary, for sure. But there's a whole range of programs that we can be using to mitigate them. And the bond market is going to be assessing how those dollars are spent, not the headline dollar. And I know that because it's my job. Every budget I sit there and I say, this is going to contribute this to GDP and this to this. And bond markets do a rate. They actually do it with algos immediately. So you'll know Tuesday. You'll know within minutes of after-hours trading how the global bond market is perceiving it. And I strongly suspect that the movement in the bond market will be minimal, which will facilitate additional borrowing should we need it.
So do you think that, I mean, I think you just argued that most inflation, or maybe just most inflation currently, is not influenced by domestic activities, domestic policy. I mean, almost as if we could just close down any part of the government that worried about inflation. Not worried about mitigating it, but trying to control it. So can we just close down the central bank?
Well, some people. So are you familiar with the concept of the Taylor rule?
I am indeed.
Oh, does he teach it or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do.
I was saying it was like a generic you.
But
like
I'm pretty sure most of the audience doesn't know about the Taylor rule, because that's getting a little geeky.
But yeah, okay. So, okay. It was like a broad you. It wasn't like you, respected economist sitting next to me. Are you familiar with the basic Econ 101 concept? So there are many who actually believe we should be abolishing central banks and that the market should be determining the rate. And I think what we're seeing central banks deal with right now is the view that, well, maybe they've lost some credibility entirely, that they kept interest rates so low that it created problems. Now they had to hike so fast that it's creating a whole set of other problems. What if the market had just determined it? Now, some pushback you'll get from that is think about COVID. We experienced the largest unemployment shock of all time, and the central banks were able to lessen that. But anytime that you add human judgment to an economic decision, you increase the possibility of error. So absolutely there are some that would say we should let the market come to this. There's other people that say...
What do you say?
I just look at the data.
And say what?
So I would...
And say what?
Okay, so I would say that the cure for high prices is high prices. So there's an element of letting this market kind of clear itself. But at the end of the day, I think that every single person in this room, if they walked by a mother trying to feed their child and they had a bag of groceries in their hand, would provide some assistance. And that is the base core of all of this, is that we as a society try to help people who are struggling. And there are global market factors that are making that much more difficult in the current environment that are not at our base control. And therefore, I think it's a public good, and that most people would agree that we should be mitigating to a certain extent.
Okay.
I'm not sure I agree.
Yes, good.
You get the final word on this.
Oh.
Well, so we have moved into question 4, which is, can we and should we reduce inflation? So Frances has argued that it's a pretty difficult thing to reduce domestically because there's a lot of global forces that are way beyond our control.
Can I just add that there are elements that exist in Canada that are problematically inflationary. We have a ton of ridiculous interprovincial barriers that make things more expensive than they could be. There's, a whole swath of things that we could be doing to bring down some of the costs that exist in this society. My point is that this inflation that we're all here to talk about today is, especially what's left of it, is being driven by global factors. And if we don't admit that and start from that point, then we're going to be fiddling with all the side issues and not dealing with the main issue at the heart of it.
So do you not think that the Bank of Canada, first of all, knows that there are a lot of global forces out there that are influencing inflation, and it's focusing on the other parts? I mean, it clearly knows it can't do anything about the war in Ukraine. It knows that it can't do anything about supply chain disruptions. So you used to work there. Is your view that the bank is
very smart people? So here's
aren't they
here's what else
thinking
central
through
banks
this?
know and that their models tell them. And it's a tricky concept called inflation expectations. Inflation expectations are a powerful driver of what happens ahead. So if I expect that prices are going to, let's say I want to buy a couch and I think the prices are going to go up by 10% tomorrow, I'm going out right away to buy a couch. And then all of a sudden everyone's going to buy a couch and those prices ramp up. Or you can experience the Japanese situation where if I say, well, if I just wait another week, it'll probably go on sale another 10%, and then no one ever buys a couch. So inflation expectations can be a powerful driver, and the central bank's most powerful tool in this environment is not actually, in my view, containing supply and demand, but actually making sure that all of us believe in our hearts. Oh, who says that? All of us believe that this concept is a blip. So every time Governor Macklem says we can and we will bring down inflation to 2%, I don't believe that he really thinks that. I think
he's just trying to get you to believe
he believes that we need to believe that in our heart of hearts to avoid a wage price spiral. So that is the power of the central bank.
So I'm glad you ended with a wage price spiral, because you have a problem with monetary policy that's trying to prevent wages from rising.
In an environment where, have I mentioned this chart? Where we're going to have the smallest working age cohort in half a century. That's why unemployment rates are as low as they are. So to try and crank up unemployment rates to be able to tame inflation is cruel and unusual punishment and goes against any Econ 101 teaching, which is the less supply you have, the more prices will go up if demand is at all elastic. Yes? Okay. But I want to go back to why I didn't.
You still get the last word. This is your, go, yes.
Okay.
Do it.
So you asked the question, do we even need a Bank of Canada? And believe me, I have been thinking about that question a lot because I keep getting asked it. And it is something that maybe people in this room will know and maybe will not. Did you know that the demand for a Bank of Canada was the second demand of the Regina Manifesto in the 1930s? It was a progressive demand for price stability, because farmers and low-income people were being creamed by price volatility. And you know who was setting the bank rates then? The banks. Even the banks wanted a central bank to do the heavy lifting on setting some kind of mechanism for price stability. So yes, we need price stability. Yes, I think the Bank of Canada still has one job, which is price stability. I just think it's using the wrong playbook, and it needs to be doing it hand in hand with fiscal policy to mitigate the effects. Like, it needs to do what it can do on price stability, but cranking up unemployment is nuts at a moment like this, because the people that are doing this policy, we're used to an idea called NAIRU. Do you remember NAIRU, non-accelerating?
Do you know what NAIRU is?
Do you know what NAIRU is?
Actually,
Do you
I'm
guys know
old
what
enough
NAIRU
to
is?
not understand any acronym.
Okay.
The non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment, which drove everybody crazy that was marginally employed in the 1990s, is something that is still in the backs of their mind. But they will not tell you what NAIRU is in 2023. They will not tell you, is it 5%? Is it 7%? Is it 8%? At what point is the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment the sweet spot? They just say, you know, we need to cool demand to tame prices, let supply catch up. And you've done such a good job of explaining why
The other way
that's
I
not
think about
working.
that, I'll just jump in for really 1 second. In the beginning, when we had, inflation was going up very, very quickly, the benefits of inflation, the benefits of hiking rates clearly were larger than the costs. But now we're at a point where the ability of each incremental hike to bring down broad inflation is becoming very small, but its impact on the labor market is much larger. And this is in part why the Bank of Canada has said, let's just pause and assess, because you're not actually getting equal cost benefits at each part of the rate hike or cutting cycle. So we're now at a moment where we have to say, any additional rate hikes from here is probably having minimal effect on inflation. It's not going to bring down food prices, but it is going to raise unemployment. So we were on a different type of call yesterday, and someone said, we're going into a recession. People are going to be worried more about having a job than they are about the price of bread. No, in the next year to 2 years, people are going to be worried about the fact that they don't have a job and the price of bread. That's the problem that we're heading into.
Yep.
And if the Bank of Canada said, we're going to keep hiking, it would have minimal impact on inflation, and we'd have more people who were unemployed and worried about the price.
The two of you have come along, have evolved in the last 45 minutes.
Okay.
Because you just said that, yes, we need the Bank of Canada. It needs to focus on inflation. It just needs to do it a little bit more sensibly. And you just said their original rate increases a year ago exceeded the cost benefit, passed the cost benefit test, but maybe not so recently. So you're both now saying Bank of Canada is aiming at the right thing, it's doing it more or less the right way, but they might have gone too far.
You have a moderating impact on us.
And I wasn't saying anything.
Except I just want to go back to another disagreement I have with Francis.
Oh, I love it. Go.
Okay? So,
and then we're going to open it up to the floor.
Yeah, okay. But I just have to finish this one thought. First of all, it wasn't this last rate announcement, but two rate announcements ago that Tiff Macklem used the word humility. And I think this is an underused word amongst decision makers. The banker, and it was a banker that said, you're talking inflation, that's yesterday's news. People are worried about unemployment, they're not worried about price of bread. That person is not going to be unemployed. Francis is absolutely right to say that people are now worried about unaffordability and prices going up and maybe losing their job. This is an incredibly difficult moment for the Bank of Canada to move. And that's why I mentioned Christine Lagarde. They can't do it alone. And they don't have to do it alone. They're not the only tool in the drawer. We need more fiscal policy to be stepping up to the plate, to be doing school food programs, to be building housing. For heaven's sake, we just saw an auto plant move from Windsor to Detroit. And most Canadians, 80% of Canadians, live in a city with public transit. What if we built our own public transit and just made sure there was cheaper public transit and more of it? In 80% of in the place where 80% of Canadians live. I mean, there's so many things we could be doing to lower costs and make prices more, make access more affordable. And I guess I just want to end with one thing, which is you said most of the causes of inflation are now international, they are not domestic. But just like at the beginning of the pandemic, where the price of lumber went through the roof because everybody was renovating because they couldn't travel anywhere, one of the most large increases in inflation now is the cost of travel, eating out. It's people with discretionary funds burning holes in their pockets. They want to go out and party, they want to go out and play, and there's just not enough people to serve them. And whether that's pilots or hotels or restaurants. And so the discretionary spending is actually screwing things up tremendously. The other part is the Bank of Canada screwing things up for mortgages, which is spilling over into rents. And so those are really important domestic features, is this kind of bifurcated what's causing it domestically. Part of it is a policy problem. Part of it is some people were inconvenienced by inflation, and it's not stopping them from going out and spending, and we have no policies for that. And I don't want to ding anybody. I just want to point out that some of the domestic drive is we just want to go out and play. Everybody's tired. There just aren't enough people to serve us, to literally serve us.
We actually agree on this, and sort of my conclusion and my critique has never been that the Bank of Canada was making, wrong decisions or they weren't looking at the world properly. My critique is that why are we relying on one institution with one tool to solve what is an incredibly complex development?
So on that point, Chrystia Freeland, our federal finance minister, is about to introduce a budget next week. And she has been saying lately that she wants to use fiscal policy, but in the opposite way that you're talking about. She's doing lots of spending. We could have a debate about that. But one of the things that I think she has been saying, and that she will say on budget day, is that we have to do a little bit less spending so that the Bank of Canada doesn't have to raise interest rates so much. So that's exactly bringing it into, using fiscal policy to try to reduce the inflationary pressures. So that's the opposite of...
Yeah, because I think that is Econ 101. If the government spends too much...
I've heard a couple of comments about Econ 101 that have been sort of negative. I think Economics 101 is a wonderful thing.
It is a good thing.
It really is. It's the basics. I'm just saying that sometimes the shibboleths are wrong.
Okay, fair enough.
So, I mean, this takes us right back to Doe. At the beginning of this conversation, we had a conversation, do government spending more cause inflation? Chrystia Freeland is channeling that by saying we're going to keep our powder dry and we don't want to be counterproductive. We don't want to actually undo the work of the Bank of Canada.
Right.
Instead of saying, actually, if we spend in certain ways, we are going to decommodify.
And she will be doing some of that too. A fair amount of it.
I imagine she will do some of it, but the message track is prudence. The message track is don't mess with the Bank of Canada's policies.
Yeah, but you know what? I feel like we're missing. There's two elephants in the room here, which is that we're having this discussion about inflation right now and a budget on Tuesday. If we were having this Douglas Caldwell Layton conversation 3 to 6 months from now, we would be talking about recessions. We would be talking about the rise in unemployment and the significant stresses in the US banking system, which are likely to turn this whole story around temporarily. So a lot of our comments are focused, I don't want to speak for you, when I talk about inflation, did I lose it's back, okay. I can project. We're thinking about inflation and what it means for us in the next decade. In the next year, what we're likely to see is that this conversation is going to shift towards, we've got a rise in unemployment, we've got stress in the banking system, we've got, 20% of mortgages in Canada now have an over 30-year amortization. That's weird. That shouldn't happen.
The Jack Layton essay competition next year, which will be just before this event, may well be, what do we do about the recession? And hopefully it won't be, because hopefully there won't be a recession.
This is Minister Freeland's problem, is that she has to present a budget, probably knowing, I haven't spoken to her, probably knowing that she can't provide funding for the recession that hasn't occurred yet, but sometime before the next budget, I strongly suspect that they have to put money to work.
Yep.
And when people are unemployed and they don't have jobs, I don't think you're going to hear the same sort of, well, we don't want to spend because it might create some inflation.
You're quite right.
You're going to see something else. So that's going to change this conversation for the next 12 months, but I would encourage everyone to remember this, because when we come out the other side of the recession, we're probably still going to see inflation that's somewhat elevated.
Okay, we are going to turn it over to questions from the floor. Abigail, you are number 1. Jimmy, you are number 2. I mean, you can bank it for later, but the interest rate's very low. I mean, you don't get more questions if you bank it. We've got a microphone in the aisle? Okay.
Okay. Check. Okay, wonderful. Thank you guys so much for being here. This has been a really enlightening discussion, and it was great to hear both of your perspectives. Sorry, I don't know how close to stand.
Closer, I think.
Closer? Closer?
Yes. Closer.
Okay. It
the
sounds like I'm
microphone.
really loud. Is that good?
Yeah, it's
Okay. So much of what you talked about were things that when Jimmy and I were writing the essay, we discussed at length, and there are so many elements to the issue of inflation that are dynamic and interrelated, and by addressing one, are you making the other worse or vice versa? And so there were lots of things that we considered that we didn't end up putting in the essay, but which are super important. So for instance, one thing that you guys mentioned was the need for a school lunch program. And so we had talked about the rising food prices and how this essential good that people buy in their daily lives is really putting a stress on the low and middle income families in Canada. But when you think about fiscal spending, something we learned in our macroeconomics class was that there's this tension between wanting to spend money quickly and wanting to spend money intentionally that is well targeted and really gets at the root of the issue. But you don't often know what that is until time has passed. And so, for instance, with the school food program or with just a national food program, I was surprised to learn that Canada doesn't have an equivalent of what the US has in the SNAP program. And so I'm wondering what you guys think about that, of needing to address an issue such as food security, because as we've seen in the latest CPI report that just came out today, food prices are still up year over year. They're up 10.6%. This was the 7th consecutive month of double-digit increases year over year. And so food prices are really putting a strain on people. So do you see it feasible to pursue a national food program? Or is this something that's so complex and intentional that by the time it's implemented, we'll be in the recessionary period? And so probably it would still be relevant then, but I'm wondering how you balance this need for immediate relief in key areas and needing to go through the full government process of spending.
So do you want the focus on the national school program, national school lunch program, or school food program?
Yeah, I think with a focus on food would be great, but if there are other examples you have as well, that would be
Focus on
also
food.
good.
Yes, I have a couple high-level thoughts. The really big issue we have with food is a year and a half ago, if you spent, is it me? Am I the problem? Okay. Keep going. I'm getting hand signals like I'm Taylor Swift on the Eras tour. Okay. Just keep going. Okay, so I'm just going to keep speaking. Got it. Oh. Okay, so there's a couple of problems with food price inflation. We already talked about how this is largely driven by global weather dynamics, et cetera. A couple of years ago, if you spent $100 before COVID, you spent $100 going to the grocery store. You are now spending $120 for that same basket of goods. If inflation goes back to 2% and central banks claim victory, next year you'll be paying $121 and change. We are not likely to see food deflation. So we've just experienced a massive price level adjustment, and that's probably going to happen on a huge swath of data and inflation data over the next 20 years as we all go through a lot of changes. Like I had to buy a bunch of metal plastic straws, huge expense. Now I've adjusted, right? So there's all these things that are going to happen, but we're not going to see deflation. So we've seen a price level up. The second issue that we have with food price inflation is it's not like we all just started eating more, okay? This is not a demand side issue, except that I did see this Wall Street Journal article. I tweeted it the other day that said, if you're really worried about food prices, try skipping breakfast. It feels like I'm in Black Mirror. This is so weird. Why would you do that? I think I texted it to you. I was like, did you see this craziness? So that's an issue. So this is actually something that Armine has taught me over the years, because we often do get consulted and we often are asked by policy at different levels, like, what are your suggestions? And I've always been very myopic. Like, we need to get money out the door really quickly. COVID was an example of that. And I think we're going into a period where we're going to need to get money out the door really quickly. But there's a beautiful confluence of things like necessity breeds invention, or the urgencies that will come from the next recession can be used to invest in programs that will be good for many, many years to come. And as I suspect in the next recession we'll still be dealing with affordability, I hope that it creates a pocket of recognition that we can be using maybe bond markets letting us get away with a little bit more borrowing towards programs like pharmacare, food programs, but absolutely, there is a sweet spot, and it's up to those who, study policy and go work and make our world a better place to find some of those. And absolutely, one of the reasons I love the school lunch program idea is because I think it is a good merging of those two, the cyclical and the structural. But Armine, you've done a lot of work in this area. Do you want to opine?
I said to Armine, you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to. You can go to the next question. She said, I really want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
So here she is.
I think your question being framed in. Am I dead too? Hello. Hi. Your question being framed in the context of fast or thorough is a false dichotomy for many programs, including the school lunch program, which has appeared in the mandate letters of both the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister responsible for children and families, because there has been such significant work by activists in Canada for decades trying to get Canada to join the rest of the world in providing a school lunch program, which exists everywhere. SNAP isn't a school lunch program. SNAP is over and above a school lunch program, which the United States has had in place since the 1960s, and we have not. And there is no excuse for it. What we have that the US doesn't have is supply management. That's another way that you can actually keep certain basic foods affordable, which economists by and large love to hate, particularly when it comes to dairy. But that's the reason why our dairy prices and our egg prices did not spike the way they did in the US, because they were supply managed. Of course, nobody talked about that if they were an economist while it happened. They'll just say how terrible it is that the dairy farmers sponsored some sports league or some bullshit like that. I can't remember what. But most people did not see sky-high prices for milk and butter and cheese and eggs because we have supply management. We no longer have that when it comes to grains because that was abolished under Harper. But that was one of the ways we kept wheat prices low so that we didn't have to worry about bread and pasta and some of these things that also, one of the reasons they got rid of it is because we export so much of it and they wanted to have the farmers wanted higher prices. I want to say two other things about food programs, because you said it was the seventh double-digit increase was this month consecutively. And what you didn't say is what Stats Canada has been saying every freaking month, which is that for the last 15 months, food prices, the food basket has eclipsed the price inflation of the overall basket. Food is extremely expensive for poor people. So how do you deal with that? Well, partly, I learned something in the 1980s when I was working on poverty programs in Toronto. There was the executive director of St. Christopher House that told me, you solve the housing problem and you solve the hunger problem. So let's get less of our budgets being spent on unaffordable rents, particularly in the big cities. You can also make sure that we are recession ready by improving EI. This government has been put in their platform since 2015, before they were elected, that they were going to improve EI. We're waiting. Like, what's the holdup? I worked in the deputy minister's office for 2 years. We talked about the need for a reform which hasn't happened in 30 years. It's a generation since we've seen any changes to the EI program, and we're still waiting. We don't know why we're waiting, but we're still waiting, and we're staring down the barrel of a recession gun. And then the last thing I'll say is minimum wage. You think you can't afford food? Try paying workers more. That might actually help affordability and food insecurity. The end.
Okay. All right. Jimmy, you are up. Armine was getting a little excited there at the end. Is your question going to ramp her up again? We can hear you, I think. Can you hear me? We're having microphone problems here at the Max Bell School.
I can repeat the question on the microphone for the live stream.
Is that better? Better? See, okay. I guess my question was going to be about tariffs, which are significantly high.
It's about parents? It's not my expertise.
Thanks.
I love that he goes right back to his
Yeah,
Okay, this is good.
It's a good
Now we
spot.
can hear you beautifully.
yeah. So I guess my question was going to be originally about tariffs in Canada, which are
Parrots?
tariffs. Sorry, tariffs, particularly on
Sleeping, he's not dead.
on dairy products, on animal products, on cereals. Their product is around 200% tariffs. But I guess I get your point of view. But I guess my other question I was going to ask about is about competition itself in Canada. There has been significant debate right now currently on modifying the Competition Act. And to what extent, my question is, to what extent does competition levels here and agglomerations of large corporations, right, contribute towards inflation in Canada?
Excellent question.
Okay, competition.
Oh, there's a lot to unpack there, but the core of both of your questions comes back to, while the go-forward rate on inflation is probably driven by external factors, let's talk about what we can mitigate. And where are prices within Canada problematically higher? Where can we work on actually reducing them? So I mentioned interprovincial barriers. Tariffs are another area. The problem with tariffs is that global tariffs peaked in 1932 with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and they have been falling since 2016. And only now are they starting to tip up. And this came after the initial President Trump election and Brexit. So if you actually chart global tariffs beginning in 2016, they're actually moving upwards. And this is when, like, if I want to talk about deglobalization and someone from marketing makes me put up a slide, that's the one that I put there because it's the best example of that. So it's going to be difficult in an environment where everybody is raising tariffs, which seems to be the dimension that we're going in, for us to go in a different direction. What we tend to think about when we consider geopolitics and how it might change the global environment and therefore markets is that we actually expect to see resurgence of trading blocs. So much more focus on Canada than the US, Canada becoming even more dependent on the US, Asia trading much more like a regional bloc, in Europe as well. So unfortunately, I don't see that area as being an area where we could see relief. Competition is a huge issue. Canadians pay, I forget the number, substantially more than most other peers on telecoms. That's another big issue. And there are other industries which I may or may not be affiliated with, which are also receive some of that criticism. So this is something I think we could start with, but that's a long road. That might be something that helps us with the inflation data like a decade from now. But I think that the crux of your questions is 100% how we should be thinking is, what is in our control versus what is not, and let's stop trying to, raise interest rates or blame the wrong thing and focus on what can we do at home. So I really appreciate the angle that you're coming at this with. I'll pass to you.
Armine?
I also really like the competition question. I know nothing about tariffs, so ask her all about tariffs. The competition story is now endemic because we have had how many years of almost free money have we had? 2008.
14.
14 years of almost free money means that people with deep pockets leverage even more expenditures and buy out their competitors. And that's what we have seen is corporate concentration in sector after sector after sector for over a decade now. So we are seeing it in groceries. We are seeing, we already had it in telecom, but Harper tried to expand competition, and really the competition was the baby sister of the people that were already there. We have it in mining. We have it in basic foodstuffs. We have it in fertilizer. We have it in every major banking. We have it in every major sector, growing corporate concentration because it's been free money for a decade. And actually, capitalists don't like competition. They like control. And so they're going to control the competition to the extent they can. So how you deal with it, I'm not sure. But you are looking at a world in which the world is struggling with not enough competition, and some of these companies are bigger than the countries that they are operating in. That, like, it's very difficult to, when you say you should think about what you can do with your own stick, unless we are working in a concerted international fashion, it is extremely difficult to tax them, to prevent profit shifting and tax avoidance. It's very difficult to come up with rules that say thou shalt be competitive, unless there is some kind of you can run but you can't hide from the richest markets. And that's the opposite of deglobalization. So we are kind of in this weird liminal moment. It's like neither fish nor fowl. What we had isn't working. What we need to have isn't here yet. And we're somewhere in this middle ground of what does the new globalization look like? Because we can't do it as individual countries. Certainly Canada can't do much on its own if the US doesn't play ball.
This would be a great topic for next year's Jack Layton competition, which is competition, right? What do we do about competition in this country? We could actually start enforcing and rewriting the competition laws, so we could do that.
Can I just say one thing?
No, you can't. Okay, yes, you can.
Did you know the very first Competition Act in North America, I think in the world, was from Canada? It was a shitty piece of legislation, and the United States came in afterwards, but it was from the 1890s. And Canada defined what it meant to have competition legislation, to prevent monopoly in markets. So we can do it. We've done it before. We can do it again.
There you go. Danielle Belland, Director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada.
Hello, thank you very much. I don't know if that was not on purpose, Chris, but as soon as this wonderful conversation started, the Minister of Finance in Quebec City tabled this budget, right? So I received the news by email while you were talking about, news updates about the budget, and the biggest maybe item that the journalists are picking on, are really emphasizing is a tax cut. So 1% tax cut for people in the two lowest brackets, personal income tax brackets in Quebec. So people earning below $98,500 a year, okay? That have an income below that amount. So the question is, and that's maybe students will learn from this as well, some people had criticized this idea before because it was part of the CAQ's platform during the last provincial election. So the CAQ says, we are increasing spending, this is not affecting spending, it's just we won't pay the debt as fast as we, as some people wanted us to do. So the question is it a good or a bad idea? What they have done, it's not just an idea now, it's a policy. So cutting tax at this point, is it good or bad, and why?
Now, if you cut in the two lowest tax brackets, it will also cut the taxes paid by people who are in higher brackets, right? They have cut it that way, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, tax cuts.
I was going to go exactly there first off. When we had the middle class tax cut at the federal level, everybody railed about it because it wasn't cutting taxes for the middle class. It was the middle bracket tax cut, not the middle class tax cut, which affected everybody, especially the rich, which is the last thing you want to do because just like Scott Moe's Mobucks, it is inflationary. You are literally sprinkling money throughout the system, and the people with the most money, who were inconvenienced, but not that much, by inflation, now have more money to go and spend. Why would you do that?
Yeah. So my first question, Consuffit Kamalsi, was how did they fund it? Because that's a component of the story to me. So if they're funding it is reducing debt, I actually think that we have in this country a false and unnecessary obsession with balanced budgets and the speed at which we pay them down. Generally, and my view of this comes from working in global bond markets for the last decade plus, Canada is always and every time viewed as a AAA credit that is, if a global bond investor wants to buy a bond or lend money, Canada is always near the top of their list, and what we call provincials usually do pretty well. So sometimes the provincials get compared to themselves when it comes to finance, but and I realize I'm probably telling you many things that you already know, but you asked for the perspective. So I think that it would be okay to finance policy that supports Quebecers by saying we're going to reduce a little bit slower. But I'm going to agree with Armine that when we talk about targeted spending, a tax cut would probably not be in my top 5 choices, especially because, as we talked about, we really want to be thinking about what type of inflation has come through the system. Food, energy, especially types that will not come down with higher interest rates, which I've yet to work their way through the system. So I would have probably put in my top 5 things that are a little bit more targeted. Because you know what my first thought was? Oh, did my taxes just go down? Maybe we could get this. That's inflationary. That's bad. That was my first thought. So yeah, that's generally my perspective. Is the microphone on? Yeah. Okay.
Of course, the Quebec government may have a different objective. So, in fact, a tax cut may have accomplished its objective perfectly.
To fulfill an electoral pledge, that's the main goal, I think.
Okay. So we are down to the last few minutes. So, Anil, you've got a question, and you just should know that you are now what lies between all of us and a glass of wine. No pressure.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. All right.
Well, first of all,
Take
I
it
just
away.
want to thank both of you for this enlightening conversation today. I want to bring things down to the ground a little bit. And my question is about credit. And, you know, we've talked about, you know, what's happening at the ivory towers and like how our decisions have rippling effects across the economy and our lives. But the fact of the matter is, quoting Armine, is, you know, people want to go out. People still want to do the things they couldn't do for 2 years. And so, you know, whether or not the government's budgets balance or not, we are often relying on credit, and I believe our willingness to take on more debt is higher than ever, especially, you know, the white part of the chart, like the working population. So how do those dynamics play into sort of this scenario we're headed towards, and whose budget matters more when it comes to balancing, the government's or mine?
Not the government's. Sorry. This is like blasphemy for an old school economist to say that we don't necessarily need to be targeting that all the time. So the credit channel is the channel through which central banks hope their policy is very effective. They hope that if they make it very expensive for us to put these types of things on our HELOCs or borrow on lines of credit, that it's going to slow our spending, that we don't go to Disney World because we say, you know what, the interest rate on that credit is too expensive. We have this compounding problem, which is that and I've touched on it. This is a really significant event that's happened in the last week, the failure of 3 banks in the United States and also effectively the failure of Credit Suisse, a massively systemic and important bank. We know historically that when we see stresses of this kind, the natural reaction from banks is to rein in credit very quickly. And we have things called senior loan officer surveys that tell us that. It's one of the best leading indicators of an economy. Unfortunately, we only get the data quarterly in the United States and Canada. We were already seeing a tightening of lending standards even before. So we were already seeing banks in Canada and the United States say, we're not actually going to lend to the same extent. So it's likely that these stresses in the banking system actually do even more deflationary impact and slow the economy even more than maybe 25 or 50 basis points from the Bank of Canada in that type of environment. At the end of the day, Canadians did not experience the 2008 psychology shock that the United States did. When I was young, my father always said to me, Francis, buy a house you can't afford because home prices always go up and so does your income. Terrible advice. Really bad, Dad, okay? Like, don't do that. In 2008, Americans learned that lessons, but Canadians have not. And as a result, our economy is extremely interest rate sensitive, which means that 25 basis points in Canada of a rate hike has a much bigger impact in Canada as in the United States. Do you know that for Canadians, if they take home $100, they spend $14 on the interest of their debt? In the United States, is $9, and that number is just going to keep climbing. So if it goes to 15 or 16, that's $2 or 2% that you're not spending on other areas. So this reliance on credit is a psychological issue for Canadians. We have not learned the challenges with that. We have a variety of really strange products. Like we have a 5-year fixed mortgage. We have variable rate mortgages with fixed payments. That's weird. There's a whole range of elements that exist in the psychology of Canadians that has to be rectified. And I hope it doesn't happen from a crisis, but I'm concerned that as we head into a period with a lot of banking instability, that we might have to learn this the hard way. But my goal is that, I'm never going to say to my boys, hey, you guys should buy a house you can't afford. I'm going to be like, you know what, renting's a good option and we should move towards that culture.
You're up. I think you might be the last word here.
Uh-oh. No, you will be.
Well, you're right.
You can't fool me, buddy. I think you've asked the wrong question. I don't think it is a question of whose balance is more important, the government's or mine, for 2 reasons. That's the Margaret Thatcher framing. A government is just like a household. A government is not like a household. So you've got the wrong frame to begin with. But number 2, for both a household and a government, why you are borrowing is more important than how much you are borrowing. What are you getting for what you're borrowing? In the case of a household, you are describing credit as if it's one ball of wax. But in Canada, which is so incredibly indebted, is because of our housing prices. A huge part of that, $14 on every $100 I'm paying for debt servicing, is because I bought a house I can't afford, right? Home ownership is one form of debt. Reverse mortgages are rising because of the boomers that did not plan for their retirement. Credit card debt, where does that fit in? So what are you using the borrowing to do? Are you surviving? Are you trying to have some control over your life by buying a home and building equity? Are you just partying? Those are important questions. They are very different types of questions than what balance is better, yours or mine. And we just heard an example of when a government's balance is squandered. That same amount of money for that 1% tax cut could have built more housing, could have made sure that there was high-quality childcare for all the children in this province, could have made sure that we are not bringing in temporary foreign workers who are cleaning the diapers of people in long-term care facilities because you pay them so poorly, nobody wants to do that job. There are so many things we can do with the money. The question is not just who's in the hole and who's not, it's why are you in the hole and what are you doing with the money you've got?
All right. Folks, we are going to wrap this up, and I'm going to invite you, Anil, I'm not sure what my cameraman is saying back there. I'm going to invite you all to step into the next room and have a glass of wine, or are we having it here? Are we having it here? In the next room? Someplace between here and there. There will be a glass of wine and some munchies. I want to thank you all for joining us. Francis and Armine, fabulous. Thank you very much for joining us and talking about all this stuff. I hope it is still the case. I hope it is still the case that you cannot detect my political leanings. So if I've hidden that, that's fine. Josh and the Douglas Coldwell Layton Foundation, thank you very much. Great partnering with you, and we look forward to doing it again. And you are going to say the last word, actually. Okay? Josh, come on up.
Okay, we're going to do it from this mic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Francis. Thank you so much, Armine. What an engaging and enlightening conversation we just had. On behalf of the Douglas Coldwell Layton Foundation, thank you for this opportunity. It's been an absolute pleasure collaborating with the Max Bell School. And I promise you, Chris, let's put any doubt aside. We will be back next year and for many years to come. So you can all look forward to being back here next year. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. As Chris alluded to, we do have a reception that I want to invite you to. I'd also like to address all of our viewers online. I know there are hundreds of you that are watching this program tonight. If you didn't take notes and you want to watch this again, it is available on our website, and so please come to the website and check it out again. I'd also like to just say one more thing. I'd like to thank our partners, the United Steelworkers of Canada, UFCW Canada, the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, and LIUNA 1611. For their support, we're able to make all of this available to all of you, and I think it's only appropriate for us to appreciate them. So with that said, please one more time give a round of applause to our panelists. And I have one more thank you. Chris, I got one more thank you. I want to thank your staff. I want to thank Adriana. I want to thank Weston, who are at the back of the room. It's been a pleasure working with your team. It's been just tremendous. And then also, too, a round of applause for the AV folks who've been just amazing tonight. All right, so thank you all. Listen, I guess I'm giving the microphone back to you.
Yeah, I got one more thing to say.
Okay. So that's it from us at the Douglas Coldwell Layton Foundation. I look forward to talking with all of you in the reception area. And again, thank you for your support of our foundation. Take care.
I just want to say, if you would like to speak with Francis and Armine and buttonhole them and get their views on something that you haven't learned from them already, because I think you've learned a fair amount, but I just want you all to know that we will be sneaking them out of the building at about 7 o'clock en route to a dinner. So make sure you speak to them before then. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon for a glass of wine. Thank you.